Are they trending upward? Are they trending downward? And they have different strategies. So if they're trending downward, you may think about more of a discounting strategy than you would if they're trending upward. If they're trending upward, you might think of more of a, how can I encourage more purchases? How can I make that basket size larger? But it's important to use the right pricing strategy with the right customer trend.
I'm thrilled to have our guest, Allison Hartsoe, on our podcast here today. Allison Hartsoe, is the author of The Age of Customer Equity and founder at Ambition Data, an analytics and customer-focused consulting shop. Allison, welcome to our show today, and perhaps you can tell our listeners about your background and your passion.
Thank you, Jason. It's always a pleasure to be here. And I think I have a somewhat unique background. Not too many women in their 20s were part of a big venture capital play. And that's where I got a lot of my strategic background for what drives a business. And after that first company that went big in the space, that company was called iSyndicate years ago. I then worked for a more tactical company that taught me a lot about digital analytics. And so I bring this unique perspective of marrying the strategic to the tactical from the sense of data. What pieces of data move the engine of business?
Great. And thanks for that, Allison. And, Allison, for everyone's context, we were talking, a few weeks back about, these very topics. And, at Simon Data, we spend so much time talking around the data, the infrastructure, the technology rather. But at the end of the day, none of this matters if the business priorities, the strategies, and the North Stars don't align. And this brings us to our big question today, which really I'll sort of frame in the following way. Today we live in a world where we're arguably overwhelmed by data, and with this, this doesn't mean that we can't use data as a tremendous asset, but more broadly, it really does beg the question around how should organizations actually properly set their North Stars and their strategy, in order to properly leverage their data, their data assets and the true potential of data in the organization. So with this, maybe we can sort of just start around this notion of customer equity and value. We actually released our episode with Eric Huberman at Hawk Media. We talked about the data, around customer centricity. And this was really sort of a conversation that was relevant to all brands around if you want to be customer centric, how can you think about customer LTV, CLV, CLTV, et cetera. And what are the right metrics to use as a form of best practice to drive your business forward? But ultimately, Allison, as you noted, and we discussed just before the show, customers don't care about their LTV. Customers care about the value their brands deliver. So maybe if we can sort of start, with these notions of strategies that really drive the customer experience and really asking these questions around customer value and customer equity. How should brands be thinking about this? And what are some sort of examples where you've sort of seen brands do a great job here?
So let's start at the top with customer equity, since that's not a very common term and not everyone in your audience may understand it. For me, the way I define customer equity is it's a fundamental asset of the corporation, in the same way that brand equity is an asset, or operational equity, or maybe your supply chain is part of the operational equity. And so customer equity is one unique component that creates value across the business. And the way I like to calculate it is all the individual future lifetime values of the customer base rolled up create customer equity. So we're not talking about how much they bought yesterday. We're talking about the future potential. And in other words, if I were to buy your business today, what can I count on as revenue coming in? What's cool about that is if you run the math, you end up with a number, and it is a projection, right? You're talking about fractions of dollars. It's essentially a statistical guess. But if you run the numbers, you essentially come up with all the value of the customer base in about 15 years. So projecting forward for time is 15 years. Once you have all that number together and you say, okay, here's how much I have in my customer base, I can then take customer lifetime value and use that as a North Star to drive that number higher, or adjust that number, or watch how it's rising and falling, so that I'm not just drawing back a number to say, should I buy in this channel or that channel? I'm actually drawing back a number that says, if I were to sell my company today, what would it be worth? Could I take this number to an investor and say, hey, this is how much future value is in my base already. And here's how I'm capturing that value through the specific tactical moves that we're making. So that's the general promise and the structure of customer equity. Now, you asked about specific examples and how do you take that and drive it through. So generally, one of the first ways people use this lifetime value is through cost reduction. That's an easy place to start. It's much crisper to prove that you have reduced costs than it is to prove that your particular strategy has increased growth. So cost reduction tends to be the first place that most companies start with this. And what spot in the organization has the most cost? Well, it's usually marketing and marketing acquisition specifically. So we almost always see the very first applications of CLV around customer acquisition cost. Which customers are you acquiring? Are they good customers? Are they going to continue to be good customers? And what do those trends look like over time? That's where we start.
Great. So maybe if we sort of take this question, maybe try to go a bit deeper. For our listeners today, what sort of questions should people be asking around? Am I acquiring good customers? Does high conversion rate imply that these are good customers? Should folks be looking at what they're buying on their first purchase? What are the kinds of signals might be relevant to someone who owns the acquisition budget or is really trying to pick apart the acquisition strategy to really understand which kinds of customers that I'm bringing on board are great and which ones aren't?
Yeah, and I like to think about that a little bit like a diamond. There's all these different lenses that you can look at for customer lifetime value. So let's say that I'm going to look at it from a marketing purpose. In that case, I tend to cut the time a little shorter than 15 years because I want immediate purchases from my customer base, and I'm going to make tactical decisions driving those immediate purposes. So maybe I'll run my formula with 2 years or even 1 year worth of future projection. From that, I then look backward and say, these customers were acquired with what kinds of dimensions behind them? It could be that they came from certain channels. If the lever that I pull relates to where I want to acquire the customer base. But what I prefer is actually to start in the product mix. If you were to take customer lifetime value on one axis and then plot it against the profitability of the products on the other axis, you would be able to answer more interesting questions. So usually within an organization, a company will say, how much traffic do we get on a certain product? What kind of conversion do we get on that product? And is that product selling or not? Should we keep it? Should we let it go? Well, if you have about 3,000 products, that's a very important question because there's a lot of effort that goes into supporting those products, sourcing those products, marketing those products, content for those products, and on and on. But if you look at it from the customer lifetime value lens, instead of understanding just immediate conversion, you're now thinking about it in terms of, is that product part of a cluster? Is it part of a mix that essentially attracts high value customers? And this is exactly what Dollar Shave Club found years ago when they did this kind of analysis, and they realized that it was a face moisturizer that was actually being purchased by their high value customer base. And that product was driving the repeat purchases. And it was also driving, it was the anchor to the other products that were being sold alongside of it. So it was essentially the first product that drove customer lifetime value, and then additional products were hooked on. So if you were to plot this in a diagram, you would see the top right quadrant would be your products that had high margin and high customer lifetime value. Conversely, your lower left quadrant would have low value in margin and low customer value. That's a much different way to look at your product mix and apply customer lifetime value. Now, then the question is, what are the other two quadrants, right? So top left are generally products with high margin that are not being bought by high value customers. Those are really great products to promote. And the other one is products that are low value and bought by your high value customers. So low margin, high value customer. Those are products that are important to bundle. And with that kind of data laid out in a very specific format, you can watch the trend over time. You can watch the movement of the products. You can see how the clusters change. And you can also determine with very strong quantitative feedback why certain moves should be made behind a specific product. That is also something you can trace into. Why should we promote that product? How much should we spend for customers who buy that product? So product is kind of the heart and soul, I think, behind CLV.
Yeah, no, 100%. And yeah, I think any marketer with any amount of experience will relate to great marketing starts with a great product. So 100% there. One question to ask here, and maybe to go a bit deeper, is ultimately, if you're thinking about the product and you're talking about margins, pricing is a huge lever as well. And I think for brands, general guidance is you really want to be aggressive on pricing around things where you differentiate, and on areas where, or aspects that, of what you sell that are less unique, don't be as aggressive and try to be much more competitive. How does that guidance fit in line with your quadrant? And, are there pricing levers that can also be pulled, to sort of, magnify some of the strategies that you guys went through?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of AI when it comes to pricing. I do think that if you price your products just once and you assume all of your customers are basically in this big ball of customer buyers, then you're missing the opportunity for the heterogeneity of the customer base, which is the fundamental concept behind customer equity. And we see Amazon do this all the time, where they tinker with their pricing up and down constantly. And the fluidity of that pricing is based on, what did you look at? What's similar? What did you search when you left the site? And on and on. So for me, pricing levers are not something that are as much of a analytical lever as much as an algorithmic lever. And there are some companies that are out there that are really doing a good job with that. Now, let's say you're not ready for the algorithmic side, and maybe you don't have any tools in your stack that'll do that, or you don't have enough information. If I were just going to make the basic cuts on the levers, on the prices, I would always be very careful between the high value and the low value customers. For the high value customers, it's an emotional pull that you're after. You're not trying to price gouge them. You're trying to engage their hearts and their minds and keep them long-term embedded with the company. For the low value customers, it's about cost effectiveness. And this is where a company can price itself to death, right? So I have the wrong pricing for the customer base, and all of a sudden I'm discounting to death. That's a really great place to look. So I bring people in on a $19.99 shirt, but it's actually pretty close to cost. They never purchase again a full price item. They just want the $19.99 again and again. Well, that's not a sustainable company model. And then the ones in the middle are the ones that we watch for the dynamic up and down. Are they trending upward? Are they trending downward? And they have different strategies. So if they're trending downward, you may think about more of a discounting strategy than you would if they're trending upward. If they're trending upward, you might think of more of a, how can I encourage more purchases? How can I make that basket size larger? But it's important to use the right pricing strategy with the right customer trend.
Yep. No, it's a great point. And we actually see a lot of pricing tension, in the market and within our customer base as well. And as e-commerce brands in particular, look to become more customer centric, oftentimes will find themselves in a situation where they have a whole bunch of inventory. If the alternatives are, to the inventory costs and leave the inventory unfulfilled, then the economics, can really afford a very low price, to clear, the merchandise. But at the same time, if you're looking at this from a customer perspective, you can damage the brand and you can really set behaviors in a way that aren't customer centric. And oftentimes, many companies find themselves in this conundrum. For whatever reason, they've accrued too much inventory for good reason or not, doesn't matter. And they're trying to build a great brand and really focused on the customer-centric aspects of things. Yet when they try to figure out the optimal price points, they're sort of stuck across two optimization functions. Which I think getting back to the head of today's show, from if you're going to train a machine learning model, you could train it in it could have two different ways of optimizing it. One to make sure that you optimize exactly, one to optimize inventory costs, and the other to optimize CLVs. And this is where the strategy is more.
I would always choose optimizing CLV because CLV is what keeps you in business tomorrow, right? And I know. So that sounds counterintuitive, right? So I want to optimize my yield curve for inventory and make sure that I can get as much back for what I spent in the first place. But if you do that, it's a short-term thinking process, right? And I'm short-term training every quarter, every Wall Street reporting metric, every time I have a season. That's a short-term thinking exercise versus the long-term exercise of CLV. Now, should they be mutually exclusive? Probably not. A business has to make certain tough choices sometimes, but I think having the North Star as CLV and then the yield is a lot different than the yield and then the CLV.
That's exactly right. And, I guess, my point, there would be exactly as you're saying, and just to sort of, clarify it, the machine learning in the absence of a clear strategic direction, could go either way. So it's really important that strategy in North Star is established, and the machine learning can only be as effective as the direction which is pointed.
That's true, even with all our human faults. And it's interesting about pricing, and I should say I'm not an expert on pricing, but I do know that there's an awful lot of human behavior that goes into that, and it's not as simple as should it be $4.99 or $5.99.
Yeah, no, 100%. And a big part of, sort of our core beliefs at Simon, and this sort of reflects in some of our capabilities in the platform, is really this notion of, running a longitudinal test. One thing that we've seen is that, pricing behavior really can damage customer orientation to brand and brand value and brand equity, to your point, but you're not going to necessarily tell this, within a 2-week period when you're clearing out inventory. You need to be able to track people over time and seeing how the behaviors actually affect.
But your point about experimentation is a good one, and one that should not be missed, in that as you do those experiments, when you draw it back into customer lifetime value, and that is your North Star, then you're constantly what I call racking and stacking. You're racking up wins and stacking them together to see what works with which customer group. And I think it's important to constantly be testing, constantly be doing that experimentation in order to understand how has the market changed? Are we being sensitive to the market? And that's why your longitudinal comment is important, because some people treat tests as, okay, we've learned it's not the red button, it's the blue button, now we know. But that's not the case, right? It's over and over again. So there's a place for longitudinal testing, and then there's a place for point testing. And the two have to continue to run in a logical, holistic strategy. What I see a lot of companies do is they say, oh, we do testing. And what they really mean is that they have run a test. They don't really have a strategy, particularly a strategy that relates to customer value or to business value, back-ending that. If anything, it might be a strategy related to creative. Should we spend more money doing this kind of creative or that kind of creative for conversion? So I would encourage people to think more deeply about, it's not just conversion, it's the lifetime of the customer.
Yeah, 100%. And really just thinking about, some of the key strategies as well, and the key strategic questions. How aggressive can I be with discounting before it impacts the customer experience? How should I think about, pricing across, some of the, across the 4 quadrants, of my product SKUs, and I think to the extent to which organizations can develop a POV, it can really inform their testing strategies. And I think to your point around point testing versus longitudinal testing is well taken. Point testing is just relatively mechanical in many ways, and and it's closed, it's sort of closed form, and begins and ends with the test. And it's not that it shouldn't be done, but it can be more disconnected from the broader strategy.
There's another point with your point of view that I just want to call out because I think it's incredibly important and most people miss it, is that a point of view needs to be infectious inside the organization. It needs to go all the way up to the CEO and the management team. If that point of view has not infected the management team, then you really don't have a point of view in the company. You have one person's strategy or one siloed strategy.
Yep, no, 100%. And sort of my role, running Simon Data, I certainly think very deeply about not just strategy, but the culture that supports it. And this could be, I'm sure we could spend another 2, 3, 4 podcast episodes covering just that, but 100%. And I think, it all sort of fits together, with the right strategies and the operational, components that can leverage data to drive them, with the right experimental methodologies, which, doesn't just include technical capabilities, but, again, the broader theses across the business that are open questions that, everyone is asking across the board. When it all comes together, it can work very well and really be transformative.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's the goal, right? A customer-centric transformation.
Great. So I think we're getting sort of close to to the top of our time here. First, let me thank Allison for coming on our podcast today and sharing your wisdom with us. I think this conversation for me was great because I think it really sort of contextualizes what I look at as sort of this next generation of data capabilities, infrastructure, and application. While technology can be alone can be transformative, it really requires a broader construct to be deployed. We all know this, but so often when it comes to the day in and day out of our operations, it can sometimes be lost. I think going through these examples and Allison, taking a step back and putting a bit of process and sort of frameworks behind it, for me at least, was incredibly helpful. And Allison, I know that you have a book on the market. Maybe you can sort of tell for our listeners, how they can get a copy of your book and really learn more about sort of what you're up to today.
Yes, the book is called The Age of Customer Equity, and you can find it on Amazon or anywhere that you buy books. You can also find it on my personal site, ahartsoe.com. I am actually transitioning from Ambition Data, and I have a copy of the audiobook actually coming up as well in probably this summer. I just finished recording that. So it's been very exciting to step into the thought leadership from all the different experiences that I've had over time. And I look forward to helping companies do better with their customer data.
Great. Well, thank you, Allison. And thank you to everyone listening to this episode of the Data Unlocked podcast. If you'd like to learn more about Simon Data, please visit us on the web at simondata.com or email us at hello@simondata.com.